Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a topic that's a little less about what went into medieval bellies and a lot more about what happened outside them under the cloak of darkness. We're talking about life as a night watchman in a medieval city. Yes, long before streetlights, CCTV, or even a reliable concept of personal safety. They were brave, or perhaps just desperate, souls tasked with keeping the city from descending into chaos every single night. And let me tell you, their job was a strange brew of terrifying, boring, and utterly thankless. So, before you get comfortable, maybe pull your blanket a little tighter. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's shadowy journey together. Imagine the medieval city at night. Not the romanticized version with glowing taverns and troubadours, but the real version. A labyrinth of unlit, muddy streets shadowed by houses packed so tight they seemed to lean into each other for comfort. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, refuse, and unwashed humanity, occasionally punctuated by the scent of a fresh bakery, if you were lucky. This was your office. Your job, as a night watchman, was simple on paper: keep the peace, look for fires, catch criminals, and essentially be the city's early warning system. In practice, it was like being a combination of a security guard, a human alarm clock, and a very poorly paid ghost hunter. Your primary tools were surprisingly basic, yet profoundly important. First, the lantern. It cast more shadows than it dispelled, making every alleyway a potential jump scare. It was your medieval flashlight, constantly threatening to go out and leave you in true, soul-crushing darkness. Then there was your bell, or sometimes a rattle. This was your public address system, your Twitter feed, and your panic button all rolled into one. You'd ring it on the hour, every hour, to signal that you were in fact still alive and doing your job, while also announcing the time to a city that relied on church bells for daylight hours and you for the night. And finally, your weapon. This could be anything from a trusty staff to a short sword, depending on your city's regulations and your personal bravado. It was less for epic duels, and more for convincing drunkards to go home, fending off rabid dogs, or maybe convincing a desperate thief that your meager pay wasn't worth his life. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a living, breathing entity that amplified every rustle, every creak, every distant moan. Your senses were constantly on high alert, trying to decipher if that sound was a rat, a gust of wind, or something far more sinister. Beyond the creeping existential dread, there were very real dangers. Fires were a constant terror. With most buildings made of wood and straw, a single spark could turn a block into an inferno in minutes. Spotting a faint glow against the night sky meant a frantic dash to rouse the local fire brigade, which usually meant everyone who could carry a bucket. Then there were the criminals. Pickpockets, burglars, and even highwaymen, if you were on the outskirts, saw the night as their prime working hours. Encountering them was a gamble. Sometimes they fled, sometimes they fought, and sometimes, well, let's just say a watchman's life expectancy wasn't always great. But not every threat was human. The cold could be a silent killer, especially in winter. Hours of patrolling meant numb fingers, frozen toes, and a constant battle against hypothermia. And the city's less savoury inhabitants didn't always go to bed. Drunkards stumbled through the streets, either looking for a fight or needing to be steered home before they froze to death in a ditch. And then there were the superstitions. A frightened watchman wasn't above seeing things in the shadows or interpreting a sudden gust of wind as a demonic whisper. So, what about the pay and status? Well, it wasn't exactly a glamour job. Watchmen were usually drawn from the lower classes, often older men or those who couldn't find other work. The pay was meagre, enough to survive but not to thrive. And while vital, their social standing wasn't high. They were the background noise of the city, largely ignored until something went wrong. People probably grumbled about them waking them up with their hourly bells, much like you might grumble about a loud garbage truck outside your window at 3 a.m. A typical night would involve endless circuits of your assigned district, lantern swinging, bell clanging. You'd check doors, peer into darkened shops, and listen to the symphony of the sleeping city. Distant dogs barking, the occasional hoot of an owl, maybe the unsettling creak of a gallows in the wind. You'd shout out the hour and the state of the city, all's well. Often being a hopeful exaggeration. You'd break up a brawl, escort a lost traveller, maybe even wake a baker whose oven was getting a little too hot. It was a monotonous rhythm, broken only by moments of sheer panic or profound boredom. Despite the low status and constant danger, the night watchman was absolutely essential. Without them, medieval cities would have been even more vulnerable to crime, fire, and general anarchy. They were the thin, flickering line between order and chaos. The unsung heroes who ensured that most people woke up to a city still standing and mostly intact. They didn't have flashing lights or sirens, but their constant, weary presence was the city's true heartbeat after dark. In a world where security came not from technology but from sheer human endurance and vigilance, the night watchman stood as a testament to medieval pragmatism. They were the medieval equivalent of that one app running in the background of your phone that you never really notice until it stops working. And for 18 unforgettable months, wait, wrong script. For centuries they proved that even the darkest night could be navigated, one sleepy, bell-ringing step at a time. The medieval night watchmen didn't just guard the city, they guarded the very idea of safety in a world that often felt anything but. So, you're trudging through the mud-caked streets, lantern barely cutting through the gloom, bell clanging like a lonely ghost. But how did anyone even know you were the night watchman and not just some particularly persistent drunk? Well, uniforms in the modern sense were a bit of a luxury for these unsung heroes. You weren't getting a snazzy reflective vest or a badge made of polished brass. More often than not, your uniform was simply your everyday, probably well-worn wool or linen tunic, perhaps with an extra cloak for the biting cold. Sometimes, a city might issue a distinct cap or a specific coloured armband, but recognition often came down to your tools, the lantern and, more importantly, that insistent bell. You were identified less by what you wore and more by the distinct sound you made, a kind of medieval acoustic branding. It meant that in the rare moments of silence, you were practically invisible, a phantom of law and order, which could be both a blessing and a curse. And speaking of a lack of modern amenities, let's talk about training. Forget police academies, physical fitness tests, or extensive legal courses. Becoming a night watchman was less about rigorous instruction and more about showing up and having a pulse and maybe a bit of a mean streak. New recruits likely learned on the job, shadowing an experienced watchman. This was hands-on learning, medieval style, where hands-on probably involved breaking up a bar fight with a stick or chasing a runaway pig in the dark. You learned to read the subtle signs of the night, which shadows moved too slowly, which dog bark sounded like a warning, and which distant scream was just someone having a bad dream after too much ale. Your education was in the street, your instructors were the elements, and your final exam was simply surviving until dawn. It truly was a sink or swim scenario, only with more sewage and fewer lifeguards. The real enemy, though, wasn't always the lurking cutpurse or the encroaching fire. It was the soul-crushing monotony, hours stretched into an eternity of silence, broken only by your own footsteps and the rhythmic clang of your bell. Imagine walking the same dark, smelly streets night after night with only your thoughts for company. It was meditation, but with significantly higher stakes. You'd likely develop a keen eye for architectural details you never noticed during the day, or discover new constellations through gaps in the clouds. You might talk to yourself, hum a forgotten tune, or simply stare into the flickering flame of your lantern, pondering the meaning of existence, or just wondering if you left the pot on the hearth. A moment of inattention, a lapse in vigilance, and that's when the real trouble tended to sneak in. So, part of the job was a constant mental battle against your own mind trying to drift off. It was less about fighting crime, and more about fighting the urge to lean against a wall and catch 40 winks. Despite their often solitary patrols, watchmen weren't operating in a vacuum. They were a crucial link in the city's precarious chain of command. They'd report to a constable or a bailiff at dawn, relaying any incidents: a break-in, a suspicious stranger, a merchant's goods left unsecured, or, God forbid, the charred remains of a shed. They were the eyes and ears of the city's daytime authorities, bringing back intelligence from a world that most respectable citizens wouldn't dare enter. Their reports could trigger investigations, lead to arrests, or initiate repairs. They were also the unofficial liaisons with the citizens. If a merchant left his stall exposed, the watchman might rattle his window to alert him. If a household was struck by illness or emergency, the watchman was the first, and sometimes only, point of contact with the wider city, tasked with fetching a physician or rousing neighbours. They were essentially the medieval equivalent of emergency services, neighbourhood watch, and local news reporter, all rolled into one weary bell-ringing package. And what happened when the sun finally, mercifully, began to paint the sky? As the first rays of dawn pierced the gloom, illuminating the familiar and often grimy streets, the watchman's shift would finally end. They'd make their final rounds, perhaps passing the torch, or rather, the lantern to a day watchman if the city was fancy enough to have one. The silence of their bell would be replaced by the waking sounds of the city: carts rumbling, merchants setting up stalls, children beginning to stir. For the watchman, it was a slow, deliberate march home, probably to a cold meal, a stiff drink, and most importantly, a bed. Sleep wasn't just a luxury, it was a desperate necessity, a way to recover from the physical toll and the psychological strain of facing the medieval night. They'd sleep through the bustling day, only to wake as the shadows lengthened, ready to once again become the lonely guardians of the dark. The role of the night watchman, though often overlooked by history, was a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of medieval urban life. They were the human infrastructure that kept the city from unravelling after sunset, an embodiment of communal effort in an age before technology could do the heavy lifting. They may not have been knights in shining armour, but in their own quiet, bell-ringing way, they protected the realm, one long, dark night at a time. And in the grand tapestry of medieval living, that unsung vigilance was perhaps the most crucial thread of all. So, there you were, the lonely sentinel of the medieval night, clanging your bell and hoping for the best. But you weren't entirely alone out there in the inky blackness. The medieval city, even asleep, had its own nocturnal pulse, and you, the night watchman, were often its reluctant conductor. You'd encounter the usual suspects, the aforementioned drunkards, spilling out of taverns that stubbornly refused to close at a reasonable hour, often singing bawdy songs or attempting to fight inanimate objects. These encounters were less about grand arrests and more about negotiation tactics worthy of a modern diplomat. How to get a sloshed peasant home before he froze solid or relieved himself on the Duke's freshly painted door. Then there were the legitimate night workers. The baker, kneading dough for the morning's bread, his shop glowing a warm buttery yellow. The occasional midwife hurrying with her lantern to a house where a new life was struggling to emerge. Or perhaps a scholar, still bent over a precious manuscript by candlelight, their intellectual pursuit deemed worthy of ignoring curfew. Your job with these folks was less about enforcing law and more about a nod of recognition, a silent understanding of shared nocturnal existence. You were all part of the city's secret, shadow-dwelling society, a silent brotherhood and sisterhood of the wee hours. It was a stark contrast to the daylight world where social hierarchies were rigid. At night, under the indifferent gaze of the moon. Everyone was just trying to get through till morning. Speaking of curfews, let's dive into that delightful medieval concept. The word curfew itself comes from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, a regulation often enforced at night to prevent, you guessed it, rampant citywide infernos. But it quickly expanded to mean everyone get inside and stay inside. So, a major part of your duty was enforcing these curfew laws. If you spotted someone wandering the streets without a very, very good reason, and I just really wanted to get another pint, was generally not considered a good reason, you had the authority to question them, fine them, or even lock them up until morning. This was your chance to play detective, judge, and jury, often based on little more than a suspicious gait and a flimsy excuse. Was that cloaked figure a harmless traveller, a nervous lover, or a notorious highwayman scouting his next mark? The night watchman had to make that snap judgment, often with a racing heart and a hand hovering over their trusty staff. It added a layer of unpredictable drama to an otherwise monotonous existence. The sounds of the night were another crucial and often terrifying aspect of the job. It wasn't just the wind or the rats. You'd become intimately familiar with the cacophony of a sleeping city, the distant bray of a donkey from outside the city walls, the unsettling creak of timbers as old houses settled, the muffled shouts from a nightmare, and occasionally something truly sinister, a faint scratch at a window, a distant clang of metal that wasn't your bell. The sudden, desperate cry for help that could send a jolt of ice through your veins and demand immediate investigation into a darkness that might hold unimaginable terrors. Your ears were your most important tools, constantly scanning the acoustic landscape for anything that deviated from the mundane rhythm of the sleeping world. Every new sound was a puzzle, a potential threat, or just a particularly lively ghost. This constant state of low-level alert, punctuated by moments of genuine fear, took a significant psychological toll. The sheer isolation was immense. Imagine hours upon hours of walking alone, with only your flickering lantern and the vast indifferent darkness for company. It bred a unique kind of introspection, but also a profound loneliness. You'd see things, shapes that weren't there, shadows that seemed to move with intent, the unsettling glint of eyes you couldn't quite identify. Was it fatigue playing tricks? Or were the old wives' tales about spirits and demons actually true? The medieval mind was steeped in superstition, and the night watchman was often on the front lines of perceived supernatural encounters. This wasn't just a physical job, it was a mental endurance test, a constant battle against the encroaching dread and the wild imaginings of a sleep-deprived brain. They were the original insomniacs, forced to confront the unlit corners of both the city and their own minds. And how was the night watchman perceived by the general populace? Well, it was a mixed bag, to say the least. On one hand, they were a necessary evil, a comforting, if noisy presence that signalled a semblance of order. When a fire broke out or a thief was caught, the watchman was hailed as a hero. But on the other hand, they were also the harbingers of inconvenience. Their hourly bells could be an irritating disruption to a deep sleep. Their enforcement of curfews could be seen as meddling. They were often the subject of grumpy jokes or whispered complaints, perhaps even viewed with a touch of suspicion themselves. After all, who chose to spend their nights in the dark, unless they had something to hide? They were rarely romanticised in their own time, their heroism often a quiet, thankless daily grind rather than a glorious quest. So, while the knight in shining armour got the ballads and the feasts, the night watchman got the cold, the dark, and the occasional suspicious glare. Yet they persevered. They were the humble, lantern-swinging bedrock of medieval urban safety, a vital cog in the complex, creaking machine of communal living. They didn't win battles or conquer kingdoms, but they ensured that the baker could bake, the merchant could trade, and the ordinary citizen could, for the most part, sleep soundly until the sun rose again. And in a world filled with genuine perils and flickering light, that was a victory worth ringing a bell for. Alright, so you've got your dim lantern, your clanging bell, and a staff that's seen more action than a tavern brawl on a Saturday night. But what else kept our medieval nocturnal guardians vaguely functional? Let's talk about their attire and self-preservation toolkit. Forget gore. Tex or thermal underwear, your best defense against the biting winter chill or the damp seeping fog was layers, and probably a healthy dose of internal fortitude. A thick, often patched-up wool cloak was your mobile fort, providing a meagre shield against the elements. Footwear was crucial. Stout leather boots, probably muddy more often than not, were your treads on the treacherous, unpaved streets. A good pair of boots meant the difference between a successful patrol and a twisted ankle in an open sewer pit, which, let's be honest, was probably an open sewer river. Beyond the essentials, some watchmen might carry a small whistle to signal distress or call for backup, if backup meant the other solitary watchman on the other side of town who might eventually hear it. The small pouch would hold a few coins for a quick swig of ale at a late night inn, if one was still brave enough to be open, some dried meat for a lonely snack, or maybe a lucky charm to ward off the more spectral dangers of the night. It was a minimalist existence, where every item had a practical purpose, and anything extra just meant more weight to lug around a city that felt like it was actively trying to trip you. Now, most nights, thankfully, weren't filled with sword fights or raging infernos. They were filled with the small, almost imperceptible signs of a sleeping city. You'd be looking for windows left unlatched, which could signal a careless resident, or, more ominously, a potential entry point for a thief. You'd check the security of merchant stalls, nudging loose covers back into place, or making a mental note of an unsecured cart that might need to be reported come morning. Sometimes, you'd simply find a lost tool, or a forgotten basket, left behind in the hurried retreat indoors, becoming a temporary custodian of forgotten domesticity. These small acts of vigilance were the invisible glue that held the city together, preventing minor negligence from escalating into major problems. It was like being the world's slowest, least glamorous neighborhood watch, but in the dark and with much higher stakes. And what about the city's other non-human inhabitants? The animals of a medieval city were a chaotic, often pungent, part of the nocturnal landscape. Packs of stray dogs, gaunt and territorial, would often challenge your authority with a chorus of barks, forcing you to brandish your staff and assert your dominance. Rats, the undisputed kings of the medieval night, would scurry through every shadow, occasionally brave enough to dart across your path, reminding you of the constant battle against vermin. Less frequently, you might encounter loose livestock, a wandering pig, an escaped goat, or even a confused cow that had somehow wandered out of its pen. Herding a recalcitrant farm animal through dark, winding streets was probably not in the job description, but it was undoubtedly a Tuesday night for many a watchman. It was a reminder that the wild was never truly far from the city walls, even if the wild in this case was just a very stubborn hog. The concept of a buddy system for medieval watchmen was largely a myth. For the most part, you were a solo act, a lone wolf, or rather a lone sheepdog with a bell, patrolling your designated sector. Large cities might have multiple watchmen, each responsible for their own district, but direct communication was a challenge. Shouts could be muffled by distance or by the architectural maze of the city, so you relied on the rhythmic ringing of bells as a crude form of communication. If a watchman missed their hourly chime, it could signal trouble, prompting a nervous investigation from a colleague. This isolation intensified the psychological burden, forcing you to rely solely on your wits and courage, without the immediate comfort of a partner. It was a job designed for the self-reliant, or for those who simply had no other choice. To cope with the gnawing fear and profound loneliness, watchmen likely developed their own unique coping mechanisms. Perhaps a personal mantra, a silent prayer repeated with every step. Maybe a familiar song hummed under their breath to fill the silence. Some might engage in fierce internal debates, or mentally recount the day's trivialities to keep their minds from wandering into darker territory. A hidden flask of strong spirits, a courage potion for those particularly unsettling moments, was probably not unheard of. Imagine the sheer mental resilience required to perform such a task, night after night, knowing that any shadow could hide a danger, and any sound could be the prelude to chaos. They were the silent philosophers of the street, contemplating the city's underbelly while simultaneously ensuring its survival. The challenges also varied wildly with the seasons. Winter brought biting winds, icy cobblestones and heavy snows that could obliterate pathways and mute sounds, turning patrols into a treacherous, muffled ordeal. Rivers froze, making crossings both easier and more dangerous. Summer, on the other hand, brought stifling heat, the omnipresent buzz of insects, and longer stretches of twilight, offering less cover for criminals, but more discomfort for the watchman. Festivals and market days, regardless of season, were a different beast entirely. They brought crowds, revelry, and heightened risk of petty crime, public drunkenness, and, of course, fire from carelessly dropped torches or overcrowded taverns. The watchman had to be adaptable, a master of shifting tactics based on the whims of the weather and the mood of the populace. Ultimately, the night watchman's legacy is a quiet one, overshadowed by the more dramatic figures of medieval lore. They were not kings or knights, not saints or scholars. They were the blue-collar heroes of the dark, the invisible infrastructure that allowed medieval society to function. They remind us that civilization isn't just built with grand castles and soaring cathedrals, but also with the gritty, monotonous, and often terrifying work of ordinary people, keeping the lights, or at least the one flickering lantern on, in an age before instant communication and automated security. Their human presence, their unwavering, if weary, vigilance, was the medieval city's most reliable defense against the chaos that always seemed to lurk just beyond the reach of their dim light. And for that, a solemn nod of respect, and perhaps a silent toast in a warm tavern, is surely in order. So, our weary watchman has navigated the psychological minefield of darkness and boredom, fended off stray dogs, and subtly judged the security of various market stalls. But what about the actual incidents they had to deal with? Beyond the broad strokes of criminals and fires, the night watchman was often the first responder to a surprising variety of medieval mini-dramas. Think of it as a low-budget, low-stakes reality TV show, but with more grime and less dental hygiene. One common scenario: the noise complaint. This could range from a particularly raucous tavern refusing to dim its lights, to a domestic dispute escalating into an unseemly shouting match that echoed through the narrow streets. The watchman, armed with nothing but his authority, and that bell, of course, would have to mediate, admonish, or simply persuade the offending parties to pipe down. There was no HR department, no social services, just a solitary figure in the dark, trying to enforce a rudimentary form of neighbourly decorum. It was less about legal precedent and more about, please, for the love of God and all that is holy, stop yelling. Then there were the medical emergencies, or what passed for them. If someone fell ill suddenly in the dead of night, if a woman went into unexpected labour, or if a child suffered a serious injury, the watchman was often the designated messenger. They would be tasked with fetching the local leech medieval doctor, usually with questionable remedies, or rousing a neighbour with medicinal knowledge. This involved frantic knocking on doors, vague directions in the dark, and the chilling realisation that a life might depend on your ability to find old Agnes, who knew a thing or two about poultices. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of life in an age without emergency rooms, where the watchman's swift, or as swift as medieval transport allowed, action could literally be the difference between life and death. You were a grim reaper, but also, occasionally, a very slow angel of mercy. Let's not forget the lost and the bewildered. Imagine a traveller arriving late to the city, the gates having long since closed, only to find themselves outside the walls, shivering and utterly disoriented. Or perhaps a child, woken by a nightmare, wandering out of an unlocked door into the terrifying darkness. The watchman was the beacon, the last hope for these lost souls, guiding a frightened child back to their slumbering parents, or pointing a confused merchant towards the nearest and probably only open inn, was a small but significant act of public service. It humanized the stern figure of the law, turning them, if only for a moment, into a comforting presence in a world that could be utterly unforgiving. Beyond the general refuse, there was the pungent aroma of unemptied chamber pots flung from upper windows, occasionally catching an unsuspecting pedestrian or watchman below. The sweet, cloying scent of decaying fruit from a forgotten market stall. The sharp tang of animal waste from the stables and wandering livestock. The earthy dampness rising from the unpaved streets after a rain. And then the faint, yet ever-present, smell of wood smoke from 1,000 hearths, a comforting counterpoint to the more unpleasant odours. Your nose, like your ears, became an exquisitely tuned instrument, able to detect the subtle shift from normal medieval funk to something is definitely burning, or that is a suspiciously strong odour of unidentifiable bodily fluid. It was an assault on the olfactory senses, a constant vivid reminder that you were truly immersed in the raw, visceral reality of the past. And how did a night watchman sustain himself through these long, cold, fragrant patrols? There were no vending machines, no convenient 24-hour diners. A good watchman packed their rations, a hunk of stale bread, perhaps some dried sausage or a piece of hard cheese wrapped in cloth. A flask of watered-down ale or even just water was essential, especially during the warmer months. These meagre provisions were consumed on the go, often in a sheltered doorway or a quiet corner, a moment of solitary refueling before resuming the endless trek. Imagine eating a dry, dense piece of bread in the pitch black, the sounds of the night your only dining companions. It added another layer of stoicism to an already challenging existence, a testament to basic human endurance and the sheer necessity of keeping body and soul together. The relationship between the watchman and the city's infrastructure was also a unique dance. They were intimately familiar with every loose cobblestone, every rickety bridge, every dark archway that could hide a threat. They knew which parts of the city were prone to flooding, which drain covers were missing, and which section of the wall had a suspicious crack. This intimate, foot-level knowledge of the urban landscape was invaluable. They were the city's unsung civil engineers, reporting minor defects that, if left unattended, could cause major problems. They were also the unofficial cartographers of the city's underbelly, mapping out the shadows and dangers that defined the nocturnal realm. Finally, there was the profound sense of being a witness to the city's unspoken life. While others slept, the watchman saw the illicit rendezvous, the clandestine meetings, the furtive movements of those who preferred the anonymity of darkness. This unique perspective could be both a burden and a strange source of power. They held knowledge that most citizens never even suspected, a silent understanding of the complex, often shadowy currents that flowed beneath the surface of daily life. It lent them a quiet dignity, a solitary wisdom earned through countless hours of observation. They were the city's chroniclers of the dark, recording its silent stories one weary footstep at a time. So, the night watchman's tale is one of relentless duty, unexpected drama, and a sensory overload that would make a modern urbanite faint. They weren't just guarding buildings, they were guarding the very fragile fabric of medieval society, stitching it back together every night with their weary feet, their flickering lanterns, and the relentless clang of their bell. And in doing so, they left an indelible, if often unheard, mark on the history of urban life. So our stalwart watchman has navigated the labyrinth of dimly lit alleys, their bell a rhythmic counterpoint to the city's slumber. But even in the dead of night, medieval society's rigid class structure didn't entirely vanish. How did a lowly night watchman, often from the working class, deal with curfew-breaking nobles or powerful merchants? This wasn't a world of equal justice, mind you. While a peasant caught outside after hours might face a fine or a night in the stocks, a well-born lord or a wealthy guildmaster often expected different treatment. Enforcing the curfew on someone with more influence, more guards, and frankly, more money, was a delicate dance. You couldn't just throw Lord Bertram into the town drunk tank for stumbling out of a gambling den. It required a different kind of strategy, a polite but firm reminder of the hour, a quick escort home, perhaps with a whispered warning, or, if all else failed, a decision to turn a blind eye and hope they didn't cause too much trouble. It was a constant negotiation between duty and self-preservation, a silent calculation of whose wrath was worse, the city councils or the dukes. This kind of social navigation added another layer of complexity to an already complex job, making the watchman not just a guardian, but a shrewd judge of character and power dynamics. You were basically a medieval bouncer, but the VIPs had swords and castles. And speaking of the less glamorous aspects of medieval urban life, let's talk about waste management, or rather, the profound lack thereof. While you were patrolling, you were inevitably wading through it. Open sewers ran down the centre of many streets, bubbling with a delightful concoction of human and animal waste. Chamber pots were routinely emptied from upper windows, often without warning, making an innocent stroll a high-stakes gamble with biological warfare. Animal droppings from horses, pigs, and whatever else wandered the streets added to the pungent tapestry. The watchman, therefore, wasn't just a guardian, he was a walking, talking sanitation monitor, albeit an unwilling one. A key part of avoiding danger wasn't just watching for criminals, but also watching your step to avoid a potentially disease-ridden puddle or a fresh pile of, well, you get the idea. The pervasive smell, the constant threat of stepping in something unspeakable, and the very real risk of disease were silent, ever-present companions. The Black Death wasn't just a historical event, it was a constant, lurking possibility, and the unsanitary conditions of the city were its fertile breeding ground. Every scratch, every minor cut from a fallen item, every damp, chilly night, carried a heightened risk of infection. The watchman didn't just fight crime, he physically embodied the city's battle against its own inherent filth, one unavoidable stinking step at a time. They were the living embodiment of the city's commitment to order, a visible or rather audible sign that even when darkness fell, chaos would not entirely reign. Their regular chimes weren't just about telling time, they were assurances, rhythmic statements of, "We are here, we are watching, and the city still breathes." In an age where superstition held sway, the watchman's constant presence pushed back against the unseen horrors of the night, reassuring citizens that the city was, if not entirely safe, at least under a watchful, if weary, human eye. They were a bulwark against both human malice and the imagined monsters of the dark. The physical toll was immense, more than just cold. The constant dampness from rain, snow, or simply the pervasive medieval humidity seeped into bones, leading to chronic aches, stiff joints, and a general feeling of being perpetually unwell. Hours of walking on uneven, often slippery surfaces meant twisted ankles were a common occupational hazard. The flickering light of the lantern strained eyes, and the sheer exhaustion of living a nocturnal life, constantly battling the body's natural rhythms, surely shortened lifespans. It wasn't just a job, it was a physical grind that slowly, inexorably, wore a person down. Yet, despite all this, the moment of dawn must have been a profoundly powerful experience. As the first blush of light touched the eastern sky, chasing away the oppressive shadows, there was a palpable shift. The sounds changed from the furtive whispers of the night to the gradual awakening of the city. The watchman's bell, which had been a solitary cry in the dark, now joined the chorus of waking life. Roosters crowing, church bells chiming, carts rumbling to market. The sense of profound relief, the knowledge that another long, dangerous shift was done, must have been overwhelming. The city, which had been a menacing beast in the dark, slowly transformed back into a familiar, if still grimy, home. Their work concluded, the watchman would likely make a final report to a magistrate or town elder, delivering the night's ledger of incidents. A few drunkards, a couple of suspicious characters, a runaway goat, and thankfully, no major fires or murders. They'd then retreat to their meagre lodgings, not for a luxurious sleep, but for a deep, exhausted plunge into unconsciousness, a brief escape from the ceaseless vigil. This daily cycle, this quiet heroism, often went unrecorded in the grand historical chronicles. No statues were built, no epic poems written about the night watchman, but their impact was undeniable. They were the anonymous, sleepless guardians who brought the city peace, one clanging hour at a time. They taught us that courage doesn't always wear armor or wield a sword. Sometimes it wears a patched cloak, carries a flickering lantern, and walks the lonely, stinking streets of a sleeping world, just trying to make it to sunrise. And in the rich, rough tapestry of medieval life, that unwavering commitment to the daily grind of order was perhaps the most enduring legacy of all. Alright, so our bell-clanging, mud-splattered protagonist has done their best to shepherd drunkards, dodge flying effluvium, and mediate the occasional nocturnal shouting match. But let's delve a little deeper into the actual types of infractions that would interrupt an otherwise mind-numbingly quiet shift. It wasn't always a dramatic chase scene worthy of a medieval action flick. More often, it was the persistent annoyances that nibbled at the edges of civic order. Vagrancy, for instance, was a common problem. People without a clear purpose, those who couldn't prove they had lodgings or employment, were viewed with deep suspicion. A night watchman might roust a shivering vagrant from a market stall, questioning their intentions, often leading to a night in the local lockup, which was usually a damp, uninviting cellar, until their story could be sorted out by dayside officials. It was less about catching hardened criminals, and more about maintaining a tightly controlled, almost paranoid urban environment. Every stranger was a potential threat, and it was your job to keep the city's human ecosystem regulated. The medieval pub, or alehouse, was a central hub of social life, and sometimes social chaos. Too much ale, too many grudges, and suddenly a quiet evening could erupt into a chair-throwing, fist-swinging melee. The watchman, often alone, had to wade into this human maelstrom, bell clanging desperately, staff at the ready. It required a healthy dose of courage, a loud voice, and probably a knack for knowing which individual was the ringleader and who was just an unfortunate bystander. Diplomacy mixed with brute force, that was the watchman's secret sauce for dissolving a late-night fracas. It was the medieval version of breaking up a high school fight, but with blunter weapons and the lingering smell of stale beer. Beyond dealing with the living, the watchman also held a peculiar kind of responsibility for the city's gates. While gatekeepers typically managed the opening and closing, a watchman patrolling the outer perimeter might discover a compromised gate, a broken lock, or even a determined individual trying to sneak in or out after hours. This meant sounding a more urgent alarm, rousing the gatekeepers, and potentially mobilizing a small, sleepy defense force. They were the medieval perimeter alert system, and their vigilance could mean the difference between a peaceful night and a city under unexpected siege. The psychological weight of ultimate responsibility was immense. Unlike modern security teams with layers of command, radio contact, and quick response units, the medieval watchman was often the absolute last line of defense. If a notorious thief slipped past his notice, valuable goods could be lost and lives ruined. There was no one else to blame in the immediate aftermath, no higher authority to deflect the initial failure. This pressure, compounded by the isolation and the sheer darkness, must have forged a unique kind of grit. It wasn't just a job, it was a deeply personal covenant with the safety of the sleeping city. What kept them going? A sense of community and civic duty likely played a significant role. Despite being overlooked and underappreciated, they knew their work mattered. They were protecting their neighbours, their families, their homes, and the very economic lifeblood of their town. This unspoken pact, this quiet dedication to the greater good, was probably the true fuel that powered their weary steps through countless dark nights. They weren't fighting for glory, but for the mundane, comforting rhythm of civilian life that resumed with every sunrise. They were the anonymous guardians of that rhythm. And perhaps the greatest, most profound reward was the moment of peace after the shift. Not just sleep, but that specific, almost sacred quiet of the morning as you walked home, the first hint of sun warming your face. The city, now bustling with life, was your silent testament. The baker was selling his bread, the merchant was opening his stall, the children were playing in the streets. all because you had walked those lonely, dangerous hours. It was a private victory, a quiet affirmation that you had held the line against the night and allowed another day to begin. It was like being the unsung stagehand who ensures the elaborate play goes off without a hitch and then silently slips away before the curtain call. The era of the solitary night watchman, with his bell and lantern, slowly faded as cities grew larger, and technologies, like oil lamps that could light entire streets, and later organized police forces began to emerge. But for centuries, these unsung heroes were the beating heart of urban security after dark. They represent a fundamental human truth that even in the face of overwhelming odds, a single, determined individual can stand against chaos and ensure the continuation of daily life. So, the next time you enjoy a peaceful night's sleep or walk down a brightly lit street, spare a thought for the medieval night watchmen. They were the original guardians of the dark, the human alarm system, the walking embodiments of civic resilience. They may have been smelly, tired, and perpetually cold, but they kept the medieval world from truly descending into the kind of chaos that only the black of night could truly unleash. And for that, we owe them a debt as ancient and enduring as the shadows they bravely patrolled. All right, our medieval night watchman has been through it all, the brawls, the smells, the noble exemptions, and the eternal fight against existential boredom. But what happened if they messed up? What was the accountability structure for a man whose only supervisor was often the dawn? There was no internal affairs department, no formal review board. Instead, accountability was often brutal and very public. If a watchman failed in their duty, say a major fire broke out that they didn't spot, or a notorious gang committed a series of crimes on their watch, the consequences could be severe. This might range from a hefty fine that would cripple their already meagre finances to being publicly shamed in the town square. In more egregious cases, or in times of heightened fear, a truly negligent watchman could face flogging, imprisonment, or even be banished from the city, losing their livelihood and their community. This constant looming threat of punishment added another layer of grim pressure to an already stressful job. It wasn't just about personal safety, it was about protecting your reputation and your very right to exist within the city walls. They truly were guardians with no safety net and a very impatient judge. Let's revisit the communication between watchmen, or the lack thereof. While the hourly bell was a crude signal of life, actual interaction was rare. They might, on occasion, meet at a prearranged corner, their lanterns swinging in unison, sharing a brief, muttered exchange about the night's quietness, or lack thereof. "All well, Thomas?" "Aye, mostly, John." These brief, almost furtive encounters were probably moments of immense relief, a temporary respite from the crushing solitude, a reminder that they weren't the only soul awake in the city. But such meetings were fleeting. The city was too large, the watchmen too few, and the patrols too extensive for sustained camaraderie. They were lone wolves, briefly howling at each other across the divide of the dark. The pervasive religious context of the medieval world also coloured the watchman's experience. The city was dotted with churches and cathedrals, their towering spires reaching into the inky sky. While the watchman's bell announced the mundane hours, the church bells would periodically peal for matins or compline, a different kind of timekeeping, a reminder of the spiritual order that overlaid the earthly chaos. These sacred chimes, echoing through the sleeping city, might have offered a moment of quiet contemplation, a brief spiritual anchor for the weary watchman. Perhaps they offered a silent prayer for protection, or a moment to ponder the sins and virtues they had witnessed in their nightly rounds. The city wasn't just physical streets, it was a spiritual battleground, and the watchman, in his own humble way, was a foot soldier in that eternal conflict. And what about those ghost stories and local legends? Every medieval city had them, tales of restless spirits, cursed alleys, or ancient pagan sites that still held dark power. For the night watchman, These weren't just campfire tales, they were part of the very fabric of their reality. A spirit passing through. That faint whisper on the wind, a lost soul. While a watchman's rational mind, if they still had one after all those shifts, would seek logical explanations, the constant exposure to the unknown and the deeply ingrained superstitions of the era meant that every shadow could hold a supernatural entity. It made their job not just about fighting human threats, but also about silently battling the imagined, or very real, in their belief system, forces of the ethereal world. They were ghostbusters, but without the proton packs, and with much greasier hair. As the centuries wore on, the night watchman's solitary reign began to gradually evolve and decline. Cities grew, becoming too vast and complex for a handful of bell ringers to effectively patrol. Innovations started to creep in. More sophisticated street lighting, even if it was just arrays of oil lamps, began to push back the oppressive darkness. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the concept of a more organized, uniformed, and centrally commanded police force started to emerge in various forms, a professionalization that made the lone, independent watchman increasingly obsolete. No longer would a solitary figure suffice. The new urban landscape demanded a more robust, coordinated effort. The romantic image of the lone watchman, a solitary figure against the encroaching night, was gradually replaced by the more efficient, but perhaps less poetic, reality of institutionalized law enforcement. The clanging bell gave way to the sharp whistle of a constable, the flickering lantern to the glow of an oil lamp, and later, the gaslight. Yet, this evolution wasn't a sudden death. It was a slow, inevitable fading, much like the stars disappearing with the morning sun. So, the story of the medieval night watchman, though often unwritten, is a powerful testament to an era. It reminds us that fundamental human needs, security, order, and the ability to sleep without constant fear, are not new. They are ancient, primal desires, and for centuries, it was the humble, unglamorous, and deeply resilient night watchman who stood at the fragile boundary between the light and the dark, safeguarding the dreams and daily lives of a sleeping world. They were the anonymous sentinels, the quiet heroes, whose legacy echoes not in grand monuments, but in the very peace they helped secure. And for that enduring contribution, they deserve more than just a passing thought. They deserve a permanent place in the gritty, honest history of how our cities came to be. Alright, so our nocturnal guardian has survived yet another night, armed with little more than a dim lantern, a clangy bell, and an unshakable bladder. But let's get even more personal, shall we? Beyond the standard issue or lack thereof gear, what did a night watchman truly rely on? His personal toolkit was often as unique as the individual. While a staff was common, some might favour a short, heavy club, ideal for convincing recalcitrant drunks or surprisingly aggressive alley cats to see reason. Tucked into a belt, you might find a small tinderbox. Because fire was always a threat, and a means to start, one could be a means to fight one. A small knife, not for combat necessarily, but for cutting rope, opening stubborn latches, or perhaps whittling away the mind-numbing boredom during a particularly quiet stretch. And almost certainly, a small, worn religious amulet or charm, a crucifix, a saint's medal, a pagan symbol passed down through generations. Anything to offer a whisper of spiritual protection against the very real human dangers and the imagined demonic ones that seem to thrive under the cloak of night. It was a tangible link to a power greater than himself, a tiny glimmer of hope in a world that often offered little. The medieval night watchman was also a master of improvisation. There was no manual for every scenario, a roof tile falling into the street. You became a makeshift construction worker, warning passers-by or attempting to clear the debris. A child stuck up a tree, yes, even at night. You became a reluctant ladder, carefully talking them down. A forgotten cart blocking a crucial path. You became a surprisingly strong mover of heavy objects. The job description was less enforce peace and more deal with whatever bizarre, unexpected chaos the city throws at you between dusk and dawn. Every night was a test of your adaptability, your wit, and your sheer unwillingness to let the city descend into complete disarray. And let's talk about the weather's relentless assault in more detail. We've mentioned the cold and the damp, but imagine the sheer misery of a truly torrential downpour. Medieval streets, unpaved and poorly drained, would turn into muddy rivers, each step a squelching battle. Your wool cloak, initially a shield, would become a heavy, waterlogged shroud clinging to you, making every movement an effort. The lantern's flame would flicker precariously, threatening to extinguish and plunge you into absolute disorienting darkness. Sounds would be muffled by the drumming rain, making it even harder to detect trouble. And lightning flashes could briefly illuminate the city in stark, terrifying detail, only to plunge it back into an even deeper, more profound gloom. It was a baptism by nature, every single time, a reminder of human insignificance against the elements. Conversely, think of the rare, clear, moonlit nights. These were almost a luxury. The moon, especially when full, could cast enough light to transform the city, painting shadows long and sharp, making familiar buildings appear ethereal and ghostly. On such nights, the watchman might find a small, fleeting comfort. The visibility was better, the sense of utter isolation slightly less pronounced. You could almost see the world you were protecting, rather than just sensing its hidden threats. But even then, the moonlight could play tricks, making every rustle of leaves seem like a lurking figure, every distant shadow seem like a lurking beast. The night, even at its most beautiful, was still fundamentally untrustworthy. Beyond the meagre pay, did a watchman ever catch a break? Perhaps a kind tavern owner might offer a free, lukewarm tankard of ale to the weary sentinel passing by. A grateful merchant whose shop was secured might press a coin or a piece of dried fruit into your hand. These small acts of recognition, rare as they were, must have been invaluable. They were tiny affirmations that someone, somewhere, appreciated the thankless work you did, a brief flicker of warmth in an otherwise cold and dark existence. They were the medieval equivalent of a "thank you for your service" sticker, but much more tangible and immediately useful. While the city bustled, the watchman slept, often poorly, disturbed by the very sounds he had protected others from. This constant disruption of natural rhythms likely led to chronic fatigue, a certain pallor, and perhaps a detached perspective on the daytime world. Their social interactions might have been limited, their family life strained by their inverted schedule. They were the ghosts of the day, only truly alive when the rest of the world embraced sleep. It was a trade-off, security for the city, but at the cost of a normal. In the grand, messy tapestry of medieval urban existence, the night watchman was a truly fascinating, if unglamorous, figure. He wasn't a hero in the grand romantic sense, but a tireless, often miserable, pragmatic one. His story is not just about crime and punishment, but about the profound human need for order, the ingenuity of simple tools, and the sheer, bloody-minded determination to keep the lights on, metaphorically speaking, when everything else threatened to plunge into darkness. He stood as a testament to the idea that even the most advanced societies are ultimately built on the shoulders of those who perform the quiet, dirty, and essential work. And for that enduring image of solitary vigilance, he continues to clatter his bell through the halls of history, a constant, comforting, and slightly melancholic echo. All right, so our bell-clanging hero has trudged through the muck, dodged aerial chamber pot attacks, and navigated the nuanced politics of a drunk nobleman. But there's another element to this nocturnal vigil that deserves a closer look. Think about it. While the city slept, the watchman was wide awake, witnessing the unfiltered, unvarnished reality of medieval urban life. They saw the illicit lovers slipping through alleyways, the hushed transactions of smugglers, the desperate poor foraging for scraps, and the quiet devotion of a monk tending to a sick neighbour. They knew which houses were truly wealthy, by the size of their shadows and the scent of expensive spices, and which were barely clinging to solvency. This made them, in a strange way, the keepers of the city's secret heart, privy to a nocturnal narrative that most citizens, lost in their own slumber, would never even suspect. It was like being the only viewer of a very long, very gritty documentary about your own town every single night. This unique perspective undoubtedly bred a certain cynicism mixed with empathy. They saw the best and worst of humanity, stripped bare by the absence of daylight's pretense. They knew who truly needed help and who was just looking for trouble. This constant exposure to the raw edges of society likely made them astute judges of character, capable of sensing danger or deceit with an almost primal intuition. It was a skill honed not in books, but in countless hours of observing furtive movements and deciphering suspicious silences. They developed a kind of street wisdom that was invaluable, even if largely unacknowledged by those who slept soundly. Let's talk about the specific horror of a medieval fire alarm. If a watchman spotted smoke or flames, perhaps a glint of orange through a window, or the telltale smell of burning thatch carried on the wind, their bell would switch from its rhythmic "all's well" chime to a frantic, continuous clang. This wasn't a subtle alert. It was a desperate, ear-splitting scream in the night, meant to jolt the entire city from its sleep. Imagine the sudden terror of being woken by that sound, knowing it meant immediate, life-threatening danger. The watchman's responsibility then shifted from patrol to active fire marshal. They would be the first to reach the blaze, assessing its scale, shouting orders and directing terrified citizens to form bucket brigades, frantically passing water from the nearest well or river. It was a terrifying, chaotic scene, often fought with rudimentary tools and sheer human courage, with the watchman at its very heart, a tiny, desperate figure against a roaring inferno. The sheer physical exertion of this role, particularly during an emergency, was immense. Imagine running through narrow, unlit, muddy streets, burdened by your cloak and staff, bell clanging, lungs burning, only to then join a frenzied effort to douse a rapidly spreading fire, or pursuing a sprinting thief through a maze of alleys, leaping over unseen obstacles, heart pounding in the dark. The watchman was a true athlete of endurance, albeit one whose training regimen was simply survive the night. Their bodies were constantly tested, pushed to the limits by cold, exhaustion, and sudden bursts of adrenaline-fueled activity. It's a miracle they lasted as long as they did. And as the city gradually adopted more formalized daytime governance, the watchmen often became the bridge between the nocturnal chaos and the diurnal order. Their morning reports weren't just a list of incidents, they were intelligence briefs, shaping the agenda for the town council or the magistrate. Did a specific area seem more prone to vagrancy? Was a certain tavern a consistent source of trouble? Did a particular family always leave their goods unsecured? This collected data, gleaned from countless lonely hours, informed policy decisions, led to new regulations, and helped the city adapt to its challenges. The watchman, in his humble way, was an early urban planner shaping the city's future through his weary observations. The emotional arc of a watchman's career must have been a roller coaster. From the initial thrill and fear of the first few nights, to the long, monotonous grind of routine, punctuated by moments of intense, heart-stopping terror or quiet satisfaction. They bore witness to the full spectrum of medieval life and death, triumph and despair, all under the cover of darkness. They were the silent witnesses to history unfolding, one moonlit street at a time. Ultimately, the medieval night watchman's story is a powerful counterpoint to the more celebrated figures of their age. They didn't lead armies, build cathedrals, or write epic poems. Their legacy is etched, not in stone, but in the enduring safety of countless towns, in the sleep of generations, and in the quiet assurance that even in the deepest darkness, a human presence stood guard. They remind us that the fabric of civilization is held together not just by grand ideas, but by the relentless, often uncomfortable, and profoundly human dedication to the everyday. And as long as there are shadows, and secrets, and cities, the echo of that clanging bell will resonate. a timeless reminder of those who stood vigil through the longest nights. Alright, let's pull back the cloak one last time and examine the final, often overlooked layers of the medieval night watchman's existence. Having patrolled, reported, and occasionally intervened in a surprisingly diverse array of nocturnal dramas, our protagonist also faced a unique challenge: the psychological impact of being the harbinger of bad news. Imagine it. Someone's house is on fire. A brawl has resulted in serious injury, or worse. The watchman, often the first to discover these tragedies, was also often the first to deliver the news to the affected parties. This meant banging on doors in the dead of night, rousing families from sleep to inform them their livelihood was burning, or their loved one was injured. It was a role that demanded not just courage, but a grim stoicism, a willingness to be the bearer of tidings that would shatter the peace of a household. Just a blunt, often terrifying, announcement delivered by a lone figure in the dark. This constant exposure to human suffering, compounded by their own isolation, surely took its toll, hardening some, while perhaps scarring others for life. And let's not forget the political dimension of their observations. While their primary duty was local safety, the watchman's reports could, inadvertently or deliberately, reveal larger patterns or vulnerabilities within the city. Were certain gates consistently targeted by smugglers, suggesting corruption among the gatekeepers? Were specific taverns consistently hotbeds of dissent, hinting at broader social unrest? A shrewd magistrate might glean vital intelligence from the watchman's mundane logs, turning seemingly isolated incidents into clues about the city's undercurrents. The watchman, therefore, was a low-level, unwitting intelligence gatherer, their weary eyes and ears providing data that could influence city governance, trade policies, or even preempt potential rebellions. They were the medieval equivalent of data analysts, only their spreadsheets were mental tallies of suspicious shadows and peculiar smells. The element of trust was also a fascinating tightrope. On one hand, citizens needed to trust the watchman to protect them. On the other, the watchman, often drawn from the lower echelons of society, could be viewed with suspicion. There were undoubtedly instances of watchmen being bribed to look the other way, or perhaps even engaging in petty theft themselves, taking advantage of their privileged access to the sleeping city. This inherent tension meant that the watchmen constantly operated in a grey area, where their authority was crucial, but their integrity could be questioned. A good watchman earned the grudging respect of the community through consistent, honest service. A bad one could easily fall prey to temptation or become a menace himself, further eroding the fragile trust between the people and their nocturnal protectors. Consider the impact on the watchman's family. Imagine a spouse or children living with a father or husband who was rarely home when they were awake, whose days were spent sleeping, and whose nights were filled with unseen dangers. The constant worry, the strange hours, the perpetual state of fatigue. It would have shaped family life in profound ways. Meals would be solitary for the watchman, conversations brief and snatched. This wasn't just a job for the individual, it was a silent burden carried by the entire household, a testament to the sacrifices made for the greater good of the community, even if that community rarely acknowledged it. Finally, let's reflect on the enduring legacy and mythologization. While the medieval watchman was a gritty, unglamorous figure in his own time, his image, much like the Pony Express rider, has been burnished by the passage of centuries. The solitary figure with the lantern, a beacon of order against the encroaching darkness, has become a potent symbol in literature, art, and even modern cultural memory. He embodies vigilance, resilience, and the eternal human struggle against chaos. From the lone figures patrolling the streets of Shakespeare's London, where watchmen were often depicted as bumbling but well-meaning, to the more stoic guardians in historical dramas, the night watchman endures. He represents an era when security was a human endeavour, built on raw courage and simple tools, rather than complex technology. His story reminds us that the fundamental need for safety is timeless, and the quiet heroes who provide it, no matter how unheralded, are the true bedrock of any functioning society. So, the next time you hear a distant siren or flick on a streetlight, take a moment to conjure the image of that medieval night watchman, his bell long silent, his lantern extinguished, but his weary spirit, his unwavering dedication, and his unique understanding of the city's hidden life still echo through the ages. And in the grand, noisy parade of history, his silent, solitary vigil is a story worth remembering. One final, lingering clang of the bell. All right, let's turn the final page on our nocturnal saga and consider the more nuanced, perhaps even slightly charming, corners of the night watchman's world. We've established their resilience and their grim duties, but what about the unspoken bonds and the small comforts that truly define their unique subculture? For many watchmen, especially in smaller towns, their only consistent companion wasn't another human, but a loyal dog. This wasn't a pampered lapdog. This was a working animal, often a sturdy mongrel, whose keen senses far outstripped a human's in the pitch black. The dog's bark could signal an intruder long before a watchman's eye could discern a shadow. Its growl could deter a lurking criminal or a hungry wolf pack far more effectively than a weary shout. And perhaps most importantly, its silent, unwavering presence offered a profound psychological comfort in the profound loneliness of the night. A dog didn't judge, it didn't complain, and it didn't succumb to the eerie whispers of the wind. It was a partner, a protector, and a silent confidant. Its warmth the small mercy on a freezing patrol. This canine companionship transformed a solitary vigil into a shared burden, a touch of furry loyalty in a world often devoid of easy affection. Beyond their four-legged comrades, watchmen, despite their isolation, often developed a sort of fringe social culture among themselves. Imagine those brief, muttered meetings at the edge of their patrol sectors. These weren't just reports, they were moments of shared gallows. Humour, quick exchanges of gossip gleaned from the shadows, or perhaps a secret code word passed down to indicate a particular danger. They might have their own slang for notorious criminals, for particularly troublesome taverns, or for the unique horrors of an overflowing cesspit. These shared experiences, this silent understanding of the night's demands, forged a peculiar kind of camaraderie. It was a brotherhood or sisterhood, though less common of the bell and lantern, united by shared exhaustion, mutual danger, and a deep, unspoken knowledge of the city's true, unvarnished character. They were the city's secret society, their initiation rites being endless nights of walking in the dark. And let's not overlook the quiet art of found objects. A night watchman's route was a constant scavenger hunt, not for treasure, but for the detritus of a busy day abruptly ended. A dropped purse, hopefully with coins, but often just small trinkets. A forgotten tool, a runaway chicken, or a child's toy. These items were often gathered, held in custody overnight, and then dutifully, or sometimes, reluctantly, handed over to the town crier, or left at a central point in the morning. It was a small but vital community service, bridging the gap between accidental loss and hopeful retrieval, a testament to the watchman's role as a caretaker of the city's minor misfortunes. Sometimes, if the object was particularly unidentifiable or deemed cursed by superstition, it might just be quietly disposed of in the river, out of sight, out of mind. The ritual of the end of watch was more than just going home. In many cities there was a formal, if understated, ceremony. As the sun crested the horizon, the watchman would often make his way to a central gate or a designated watch post, where he might meet the day guard or a senior official. Here, the final report would be given, all's well that ends well, or a detailed recounting of the night's events. He would extinguish his lantern, carefully hand over his staff, and receive a nod of dismissal. This was his transition from the spectral guardian of the night to an ordinary citizen, blending back into the waking world, albeit one staggering from profound sleep deprivation. It was a brief, symbolic shedding of his nocturnal persona, a silent acknowledgement of his service before he disappeared into the labyrinth of his own much-needed rest. This transition, however, wasn't always seamless. The watchman carried the night with him. The sounds, the smells, the anxieties, they lingered. Their sleep, often in a small, cramped home now bustling with daytime life, might be fitful, haunted by the echoes of their patrol. They might startle awake at a distant clang or the imagined flicker of a flame. Their internal clock was perpetually inverted, making genuine integration into the city's daytime rhythm a constant struggle. They were forever tethered to the darkness, even when bathed in sunlight, forever listening for the sounds that only they, in their solitary vigil, truly understood. So, the medieval night watchman, often nameless, frequently unthanked and perpetually weary, stands as a monument to the enduring human spirit of service. Their story is a powerful reminder that civilization, in its most fundamental sense, is built not just on grand decrees or heroic battles, but on the quiet, often uncomfortable, and deeply personal commitment of individuals to the well-being of their community. They were the anonymous sentinels who walked the line between light and shadow, ensuring that the city's heart continued to beat through the longest, darkest hours. And in their silent, bell-ringing procession through history, they left an indelible mark, a testament to the fact that even in the deepest night, a glimmer of human resolve could always be found. And that, my friends, is a legacy worth illuminating, one final, resonant clang. All right, let's flicker the lantern one more time and peer into the very specific, often bizarre, micro-dramas that constituted a night watchman's shift. We've talked about the big stuff, but what about the weird, the unexpected, the things that truly made them earn their paltry pay? Consider the sheer, medieval absurdity of animal control. This wasn't just stray dogs. Imagine a city where livestock often roamed freely, or pigs were let loose to scavenge. A watchman might round a corner to find a runaway goat attempting to scale a baker's stall, or a particularly confused cow having an existential crisis in the middle of a deserted market square. Herding an unwilling, potentially aggressive animal through dark, winding streets was a chore, made more difficult by the fact that medieval animals, much like medieval people, often had strong opinions and little respect for authority. It was a bizarre, often comical interlude in an otherwise grim routine, turning the solitary guardian into a reluctant shepherd, his staff more a prod than a weapon. Then there was the constant low-level threat of accidental self-harm or injury in the dark. Tripping over an unseen obstacle, a discarded cartwheel, a pile of rubbish, a sleeping dog, was a daily hazard. A sprained ankle, a broken wrist, or a nasty cut could be catastrophic for a man whose livelihood depended entirely on his mobility. Medical care was rudimentary at best, so a seemingly minor injury could easily become infected, leading to debilitating illness or even death. Every step was a calculated risk, a testament to the fact that the most mundane aspect of their job, simply walking, was fraught with danger. They were athletes of the dark, navigating an urban obstacle course with only a flickering lamp. What about the psychological games they played, or perhaps endured, from the very citizens they protected? The pranksters and the daredevils of the medieval night. Imagine a group of bored apprentices, fueled by too much ale, deciding it would be hilarious to shout obscenities from a rooftop, or to briefly block an alleyway with barrels, just to see the watchman's reaction. Or perhaps a more malicious individual might deliberately misdirect the watchman with false cries, leading them on a wild goose chase. These were not life-threatening dangers, but they were deeply frustrating, chipping away at the watchman's patience and authority. It was a constant negotiation with the frivolous, often cruel, nature of human mischief, making the job less about grand heroism and more about weary, exasperated damage control. The role of the watchman also touched upon the very medieval concept of hue and cry. If a crime was actively witnessed, a theft, an assault, the citizen was expected to raise a loud hue and cry, summoning their neighbours and, hopefully, the nearest watchman. For the watchman, this sudden eruption of sound in the quiet night was an immediate, visceral shift from passive patrol to active pursuit. It meant not just responding to an incident, but often leading a hastily assembled, poorly armed, and probably terrified group of citizens into the fray. It was a moment of true leadership, where the watchman had to quickly assess the situation, rally the populace, and chase down the perpetrators, all while maintaining some semblance of order among the chaotic volunteers. It turned the solitary guardian into a reluctant militia captain, fueled by adrenaline and the raw energy of collective outrage. And let's not overlook the simple, yet profound, act of observation of the celestial bodies. On a clear night, away from the worst of the city's light pollution, which was, granted, not much by modern standards, the watchman would have an unparalleled view of the stars and the moon. For hours on end, they would witness the slow, majestic rotation of the heavens. In an era where astronomy was often intertwined with astrology and theology, this might have offered moments of quiet wonder, a connection to something vast and eternal beyond the city's narrow confines. It could be a source of calm amidst the chaos, a reminder of a larger, divine order. Or, conversely, it could amplify the feeling of insignificance, a tiny human against the indifferent, swirling cosmos. Finally, let's consider the tools of subtle deterrence. The distant clang of the bell, the faint flicker of the lantern's glow at the end of an alley. These were signals that the night was not entirely unobserved. A potential thief might hear the bell and decide to postpone their plans. A would-be brawler might reconsider their actions, knowing a stern, staff-wielding figure was somewhere nearby. The watchmen didn't have to catch every criminal to be effective. Simply being there, making their presence known, was often enough to prevent trouble before it even started. They were a living, breathing deterrent, their very existence, a quiet warning to those who wish to exploit the dark. The medieval night watchman's story is a deep well of human experience, a blend of physical hardship, psychological endurance, mundane routine, and sudden, terrifying drama. It teaches us about the ingenuity of people facing overwhelming odds, the quiet dignity of essential labor, and the enduring human need to impose order on a chaotic world. His legacy is not just about keeping the peace, it's about the very fabric of human communal living, woven stitch by weary stitch, through countless nights, under the watchful, if tired, gaze of a solitary man with a bell and a lantern. And for that profound, unglamorous heroism, his place in history is as solid and enduring as the cobblestones he tirelessly walked. Alright, let's cast our final, lingering glance into the flickering glow of the night watchman's lantern. We've explored the dangers, the monotony, the bizarre encounters, and the profound significance of their role. But there's one last, crucial dimension to understand: the watchman as a figure of urban memory and historical continuity. Over years, they would have seen generations grow up, witnessed the slow, inexorable changes in the city's architecture, the rise and fall of various guilds, and the evolving patterns of urban life. They would remember which alley used to be particularly dangerous, which house stood where a fire once raged, and the specific quirks of long-dead citizens. This made them living archives of the city's nocturnal past, carrying a unique kind of historical memory that was rarely written down, but deeply embodied. The watchman's interaction with the city's architecture itself was also intimate. They knew every creaking floorboard in the market, every hidden nook behind a church, every loose stone in the city wall. They knew which ancient gargoyle seemed to watch them with particular malevolence, and which crumbling archway always whistled with a mournful sound on windy nights. The city wasn't just a place they patrolled, it was a living, breathing entity they were deeply connected to, its every shadow and sound familiar territory. This intimate knowledge meant they could navigate its dangers, anticipate its hidden turns, and almost feel its pulse through their weary feet. They were the cartographers of the city's darkness, their mental maps more detailed than any parchment scroll. And what about the stories that grew around them? While few formal ballads were sung in their honor, every city would have its whispers and legends about the local watchmen. Tales of their bravery in a fire, their cleverness in catching a thief, or perhaps their surprising kindness to a lost child. These stories, passed down by word of mouth, contributed to the folklore of the town, shaping the identity of its nocturnal guardian. They became figures of quiet legend, part of the fabric of local identity, their deeds recounted in hushed tones around hearths as darkness fell. They were the mundane heroes who inspired everyday myths. The generational aspect is also poignant. It wasn't uncommon for the role of watchman to be passed down through families, a father training his son in the subtle arts of nocturnal vigilance. This created a lineage of guardians, a continuous thread of watchfulness woven through the city's history. Each generation would learn from the last, inheriting not just the lantern and the bell, but also the accumulated wisdom, the specific dangers of certain districts, and the unwritten rules of engagement with the city's dark underbelly. It was a tradition of quiet service, a family legacy built on long nights and watchful eyes. Ultimately, the medieval night watchman's existence was a microcosm of medieval life itself. Hard, often thankless, filled with both danger and moments of surprising humanity. Their story is one that transcends the specifics of their time, speaking to universal themes of duty, resilience, and the fragile nature of order. They remind us that even in the absence of flashing lights and rapid response, communities found ways to protect themselves, relying on the most ancient and reliable technology of all, dedicated human effort. So, as we finally bid farewell to our tireless, bell-clanging friend, let us remember him not just as a historical curiosity, but as a potent symbol. A symbol of quiet courage in the face of daunting odds, of unwavering dedication to a cause greater than oneself, and of the enduring human capacity to bring a flicker of light and a measure of peace to the deepest, darkest hours. The medieval night watchman walked in shadows, but his legacy shines brightly, a testament to the enduring human need for safety, and the unassuming heroes who provided it, one weary, bell-ringing step at a time.